2 seasons, went out on loan, was at Queen of the South, Swindon, Leyton Orient last season. But getting his chance here from Michael Carrick to start in the EFL Cup tonight away at Elland Road. Now, Middlesbrough haven't had a touch of the ball inside their opponent's half yet. As the ball is played back by Aidan Morris into his own half. Daniel Barlaser. Low ball forward towards Bergson, but he's not able to hold on to it, and it's an energetic Joe Rodon who comes charging forward, gives it to Gellard into the penalty area, tries to get it onto his left boot, runs into trouble though, and I think it was Johnny Howson who guided it away from him just as the Leeds United player was hoping to get a shot away. Fast pace of the game now, as down the other end come Middlesbrough. Bergson into the penalty area now. Has a shot right-footed, goalkeeper guarding the near post, and it ricochets out for a corner. End-to-end at Elland Road, 0-0.
Bergson does absolutely brilliantly there. All he does is he's 30 yards out from goal. He just lets the ball run through his legs. Sells Max Rober a huge dummy, gets himself through on the angle with Carl Darlow. Strikes, Carl Darlow goes down into the K position for the goalkeeper at the near post. He's blocked the space, but he's fortunate, it hits the near post. The goalkeeper just gets a little touch on it. It goes out for a corner.
I love that. The goalkeeping terminology, the K position.
Trying to be descriptive, Colin.
I like it. I like it. Because as soon as you say that, everyone knows what you mean. The shape of the legs. Here comes the delivery. The corner from the right-hand side. Free header. Guarded just wide. Josh Coburn flicking it on. It took a touch on someone else on the way through. Coburn, who got 5 goals in the Championship last season. And Middlesbrough with their first proper 2 attempts at goal here. And that one just goes offside. Well, it goes wide, sir.
In those 2 minutes, it shows exactly why Leeds United concede so many goals. Such a simple corner there from Middlesbrough. Coburn makes a great run across the near post. Gets kind of half of a flick on it. It's neither a shot nor a cross, but it just drops wide at the far post. Middlesbrough had bodies in there. They could have gone one up.
Yeah, Leeds who at the second... we'll come back to that in just a moment, because Rodon is coming over the halfway line here on the right-hand side, just held up by Josh Coburn. He'll roll it back to Ethan Ampadu, dropping in between Rodon and Wöber. Wöber, the Austrian, who spent last season on loan at Borussia Mönchengladbach. He played at Euro 2024 in Germany with Austria. Now, this is Patrick Bamford into the penalty area, holding off Johnny Howson. Firpo with an uncertain touch on the far side, and Middlesbrough should have been able to clear it. They'll get a second attempt here. Howson's got to spin away from Joan Pirro, does well, rolls it back to Matt Clark. Borough play their way out of trouble. Eventually it's launched by Lucas Engel long into the Leeds United half and all the way through to Carl Darlow.
Really interesting to watch this Leeds United back 3 in possession. They're doing it again as we speak. As soon as Carl Darlow gets the ball, Ampadu drops into the middle of Rodon and Wöber, and the 2 fullbacks go so high, which causes Middlesbrough a problem. Sam Byram and Junior Firpo over the far side. They're almost playing as wingers when Leeds are in possession.
This is 5 Live from the BBC. Return to the Premier League coming up in the next few days. Our pick of the matches on Saturday will be Arsenal against Wolves for the 3 o'clock games. We'll bring you full commentary of West Ham against Villa on 5:30. You'll be at the Arsenal game, Paul?
I am, sir. Yes, I'm making my Premier League debut on Saturday at one of my favourite places.
Excellent. Rodon here plays the ball across to Max Wöber, and he comes a good 20 yards into Middlesbrough.
Alex Howes, he's 20. But also Afghan government officials, aid workers and foreign diplomats. They flock to the airport and then block runways in the clamour to escape.
I think we are in a hell, and you're waiting for 14, 15 hours without water, without food.
There was a kind of mania around Kabul airport for those 2 weeks. My family in Afghanistan, like a lot of others, tried to get out. Like most, they had to stay behind. Those who managed it had some connections, were particularly determined, or just lucky. Across Afghanistan, the majority who couldn't leave woke up to a new reality. Aid dropped by 60% the following year.
And at the same time, climate change really begins.
because the war has lasted for too long there, and people's capacity to handle and deal with these matters has been quite limited.
Many areas are becoming slowly impossible to live in.
Exactly. Afghanistan is already an arid, landlocked country, and it's overlooked by the Hindu Kush. So a snow-capped mountain range, and it's from these mountains that Afghans get most of their water. The summer snowmelt fills streams and rivers, and that's what makes life possible.
Climate change is causing temperatures in Afghanistan to rise twice as fast as the global average. It's causing the glaciers in the Hindu Kush to shrink and the rains to change, leaving less and less water for those living downstream. That's according to our next guest.
I am Najibullah Sadiq. I was born in Kabul and grown there, of course, and studied there. And then luckily got a scholarship for studying in Germany, where I studied water resources engineering.
Why did you want to study hydrology, water?
So basically, in Afghanistan, you see, in particular in Kabul, as a kid, you're struggling to fetch water for your family. The kids are the ones who are fetching water and supplying water for their families. As a general, there was lack of expertise in water resources management, and that basically motivated me to major in water resources engineering.
Is management the only reason why there's so little water?
There is, of course, several reasons for that. One reason is, of course, that Afghanistan is devastated by over 5 decades of war and political instability, and that made Afghanistan basically to not be able to develop its water resources infrastructure. And this poor water resources, water infrastructure in Afghanistan basically made Afghanistan vulnerable to the climate shocks that we are experiencing.
What sort of climate shocks?
So there are, of course, droughts, and this is not the only shock. Like the changes that we have very mild winters, and that means that rainfalls occur not in form of snow, which was usually the case for Afghanistan.
This is problematic because, as Barry was saying, the snow used to be stored on the mountains until it melted in summer, providing water through the dry season. But now that it rains, the water just rushes down into the valleys and causes flash flooding.
Flood is not only inundating and impacting the population, but it also brings a lot of debris with it, and that is basically filling your already old reservoirs that you have built from 50s to 70s. And even we have some reservoirs which are filled 100% by sediments, and basically the dam is abandoned and the dam is not functioning anymore.
And because there's less water in the reservoirs, people are digging wells deeper and deeper to tap into what's known as groundwater.
Basically water found in the cracks and gaps in the soil and rocks beneath our feet.
And that has led Afghanistan to another disaster. You see, in Kabul, groundwater level is declining at least 2 meters per year. Of course, in few years, you will reach a level where the groundwater cannot be pumped, and that's basically frightening the farmers and the whole Afghanistan, because you know, in Afghanistan, agriculture makes more than 70% of the GDP of this country.
The effects of climate change are far-reaching enough for the Taliban to take notice.
Not only do we, but the world has a duty in this matter, and it is imperative that they cooperate with us in this sector, because they have ruined the air, atmosphere, and environment of Afghanistan, and other countries of the world have also played their own role in this.
I mean, the Taliban say that they're taking these issues, and particularly climate change, seriously, and they're doing what they can to ameliorate the situation and adapt. Do you see that?
I have not seen any signs or any sort of efforts for tackling climate change.
And this is why some Afghans have been taking things into their own hands since the Taliban takeover.
Many organizations left after the fall of Kabul, and now there are very few organizations left active in Afghanistan. As far as I know, I haven't seen any organizations in Daikundi tackle climate change and climate adaptation since.
Who's this, Barry?
This is Naim Yousufi. He works on climate adaptation projects in central Afghanistan in a mountainous region called Daikundi. People live from agriculture and herding, with the main crop being almonds. I spoke to Naim a bit about his work to save water and fight climate change.
In terms of irrigation project, we would construct a standard irrigation pool to properly store their water with pipes to transport the water to people's land.
Barry, what exactly is a standard irrigation pool? What does it even look like?
So yeah, something I uncovered in my research. Imagine a swimming pool but made of cheap local materials. We're talking stones, rocks. It captures rainwater, floodwater, and conserves it for agricultural use. The project, in collaboration with the locals, also builds mini dams and pipes to bring spring water to their orchards, minimizing water loss as vapor. It's had a big impact on the locals.
My name is Ali Fayaz. I was born in 1965 in Badi Masar village. Summer has changed completely, and the seasons changing has impacted our lives a lot. The new irrigation system in areas where the pipes have been laid down has really helped. It has roughly 80% or 100% saved people's trees and harvest from the drought, but in areas where the system doesn't reach people are still really suffering. We need foreign help to help extend the irrigation system.
And that's where Afghans abroad, like Mohammed Ayub, come in. Mohammed moved to a city in Germany called Kiel about 30 years ago and has been fundraising at his mosque ever since.
Every Sunday we are a collection in our Afghan mosque here in Kiel. So we speak about the dams, about the built dams, about the new dams, and about the future dams.
قال الله سبحانه وتعالى هو الذي جعل لكم الأرض ذلولا فامشوا في مناكبها.
Normally, everybody makes some donation.
Have you managed to raise much money?
Fortunately, yes. In the help of our mosque here in Kiel, we have now donated for more than 20 dams.
Wow, 20 dams?
20 dams. The smallest with 1,000 cubic meter storage, and the biggest with 500,000 cubic meter storage.
That sounds like a lot of water. I can't visualize it, but it sounds like a lot. It sounds impressive, Mohammed.
Yes, it's very big.
قال الإمام ابن كثير رحمه الله في تفسير قول الله سبحانه.
For me, the best place for giving you a donation is water conservation in dry areas like Afghanistan.
Why?
So the return of this investment is very high. When you build a dam, it lasts maybe for 50 years. In the first year, you have your investment returned. So all the other years, you have water for free, and a lot of people can live there.
What I find amazing about people like Mohammed is that they've fled their country, had to set up a new life, you know, in a place where they don't have a support network, they might not even know the language, and yet here they are giving their hard-earned money, not to the family and friends back home, but to total strangers. I find that amazing.
What Afghans want is to build. They want a better country to go back to.
I can understand that. And the thing is that the solutions are cheap too. So what I'm wondering is, why is the responsibility of aid falling to the likes of Mohammed and not the UN or governments, especially since Afghanistan has contributed so little to the climate crisis?
Yeah, I mean, emissions, talking historically or currently, are basically nothing.
There's an argument being made by experts that the big climate polluters, China, EU, the US, have a moral responsibility to pay for climate adaptation that vulnerable and innocent countries like Afghanistan so desperately need. So the question is, why aren't they doing that?
Essentially, it comes down to a reluctance to cooperate with the Taliban because of their human rights violations, because of what the UN have described as gender apartheid and their ban on female aid workers.
Is there any way then to provide financial aid to everyday Afghans without legitimising the Taliban? Dr. Orzala Nimat thinks so.
It is absolutely difficult. And as long as there is a regime that is taking the population as a hostage practically, it will be difficult to operate and work there, but being difficult doesn't mean it's impossible, and there are principled ways that many organizations at the moment as we speak are following those principles in order to make sure that people are receiving support and aid and assistance in this situation where the government is failing to offer any support, trying to basically subordinate half of the population.
What will happen if that funding need, that requirement, isn't met?
We will face a multiple-layered disaster. One of them is migration and refugee crisis. We are already facing it. You just imagine that anyone on those boats, on those ships, trying to leave the country, anyone taking the risk, they are well aware of what it means to be on those boats. They are well aware they might drown with their children, with their women, with their families. But they take the risk because they see that what they are experiencing back in their homes is very, very bad.
Given that there are so many natural disasters that have hit Afghanistan in the last few years, there'll be many more in future, and presumably there'll be worse climate change. Is there a link in these natural disasters and radicalization?
There is always a link with radicalization, because when people are deprived of any other basic services due to poverty, due to lack of access to jobs and job security, as we were talking about, what is available for them? Radicalization in our region, in Afghanistan and the surrounding countries, radicalization pays people. They send their children to religious schools because they feed them. They cannot afford to feed them at home, so they send their boys there. So there is money, unfortunately, to radicalize people. So that danger is very serious. And it's not only for Afghanistan, not only for the region, but for everywhere, because there are connections with the West.
Despite the dire situation and the repercussions that may soon be felt all around the world, there is room for optimism for Najib.
I'm hopeful because people are increasingly becoming more aware of the impacts of climate change, and I'm spending a lot of time my weekends on these issues, and that's something I owe the people of Afghanistan, because I studied there with the taxes of Afghan people. I studied, and now it's time to pay back as much as I can. I'm sure if there was peace, I could have returned to Afghanistan and I would have been much more effective, but now this is what at least I can.
And there's something quite empowering in that, isn't there, Barry?
We have a saying in Persian, "Katra katra daryo mesha," and that means many drops make a river, which means these small projects are meaningful and that they amount to something.
Especially in a country that's now on the forefront of climate change after being on the forefront of war and conflict for so long. But the experts that we spoke to agree that these projects are nowhere near enough compared just to the scale of the problem.
There is hope. We saw that with what Naeem, Najib and Mohammed and people like them are doing. But you're right, the task at hand is formidable, and there is more to come. The great powers aren't acting, but temperatures will continue to rise, and climate change will continue to fuel more conflict and migration from Afghanistan. And maybe that's what it will take for the world to act.
I mean, listening back to that, Barry, I am filled with joy, and I am also filled with sadness. Filled with joy because I think you and producer Jordan did such a great job at making the programme, and I'm also just struck by how kind and generous people are, like Najib giving up his free time to help people build dams back in Afghanistan, and then Mohammed, of course, and the 20 dams that he and his mosque have funded.
Yeah, I mean, that kind of work goes on. We're still seeing small-scale water infrastructure being built in places like Daikundi. Mohammed's mosque in Kiel is still funding dams in Nangarhar and elsewhere.
Do you know how many more he's made since we spoke to him a year ago?
I wouldn't be able to give you a precise figure like you would. Many more dams.
Many more dams, of many more cubic meters, which I will never be able to visualize. I mean, the sad thing, listening back, was just about the aid situation and how so many Afghanistans really need it to adapt to climate change. Is there any evidence to suggest that that's changing a year on?
I mean, this is the real problem. It's hard to change a country's climate resilience on the basis of, say, funds from one mosque in northern Germany. And in terms of aid, if anything, it's getting worse. Development aid for Afghanistan is still frozen, and more immediate aid, just food for the hungry and so on, has shrunk as aid budgets have tightened due to the global economic downturn. And we're seeing other crises as well, like the war in Gaza, itself deeply devastating, having the side effect of even less money elsewhere for the world's poorest.
Yeah, and you know, when we think about climate change, we're continuing to pump more and more planet-warming gases into the sky, so extreme weather will continue to become more likely until we get a handle on our emissions. But the other big news that I alluded to before was that the Taliban hosted its own climate change conference.
Yeah, they invited international guests, journalists and so on. Very few actually went, but it was pretty interesting as a statement of intent. Reading reports about the conference, it was clear that the Taliban know that climate change is the issue impacting Afghans. So we had scenes from the conference like Taliban ministers comparing climate change to the US, as in the latest enemy that they had to fight, except more dangerous. And this is the main shift that I've seen over the past year and more. This step up by the Taliban to get international cooperation on these climate issues. They don't have the funds or enough know-how, and they know that.
Yeah, I mean, that's really interesting. And the other thing I saw that struck me was that some academics are calling for Afghanistan to be allowed to attend the big climate conference that happens every year, COP. This year it's in Baku in Azerbaijan in November. And that's where the sort of real big decisions are made. And I wondered whether there was any indication whether Afghanistan will be allowed to attend this year.
Yeah, so Afghanistan is one of only 2 countries in the world, along with Myanmar after its military coup in 2021, to be excluded from attending COP. And that in part is of course because the Taliban are not an internationally recognized government. And sanctions by Western countries mean Afghanistan can't access COP funds either. The Taliban are calling to be allowed to attend COP29. That looks unlikely, but it points to a bigger question we've talked about before. How can the international community help millions of Afghans under Taliban rule confront climate change?
Perhaps that is the climate question. Barry Sadid, thank you so much for sharing all your insights and updates with us. I really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me on.
Barry had a helping hand from producer Jordan Dunbar and editor Simon Watts. Tom Brignall and Hal Haynes are in charge of the mix this week. I'm Greg Jackson, and I'll see you next time for more of the climate question. This is the BBC World Service with highlights from this year's BBC Proms.
In 1999, young musicians from across the Middle East joined together for the groundbreaking creative and social experiment that was the West Eastern Divan Orchestra. A quarter of a century later, they remain united by the ideals of listening, respect, and mutual understanding. On their summer concert tours, they're often joined by some of today's most acclaimed soloists, and for this prom, the orchestra performs the Brahms Violin Concerto featuring violin virtuoso Anne-Sophie Mutter. The UK's greatest classical music festival from the Royal Albert Hall in London.
The BBC Proms. Saturday at 18 and Sunday at 11 GMT.
Hello, I'm Claudia Hammond. Health Check is coming up after the news. 84 countries are reporting a rise in rates of COVID-19. Maybe you know people who seem to be getting ill with it yet again. We'll be asking what's going on with COVID these days. And we have news on two other viruses we've been following recently, Mpox and Oropouche. And do you know what's inside your microwave? There could be 101 different strains of bacteria. All coming up soon in Health Check after the BBC News.
BBC News with Govinda Gill. The World Health Organization has declared the Mpox outbreak in parts of Africa a public health emergency of international concern. The disease has spread rapidly. There have been more than 13,000 cases and 450 deaths recorded in the Democratic Republic of Congo. Ukraine has said it will set up humanitarian corridors in the Russian region of Kursk to let civilians leave the area where its troops are on the offensive. A deputy prime minister said people would be able to go to Russia or to Ukraine. In India's West Bengal state, thousands of people are marching to call for an end to violence against women. The demonstrations follow the rape and murder of a female doctor. 2 astronauts stranded on the International Space Station may have to stay in space for at least 8 months. Sunita Williams and Barry Butch Wilmore have already spent 2 months in space after a planned 8-day test flight ran into technical difficulties. A military base in western Germany was temporarily sealed off on Wednesday after suspicions its water facilities had been deliberately contaminated. The Kolwan base near Cologne is a major barracks that houses more than 4,000 soldiers. The US diplomat leading efforts to secure a ceasefire in Sudan has called on the army to send a delegation to talks in Switzerland. Their paramilitary rivals have already sent representatives. The number of people known to have died in Uganda in a landslide at a rubbish dump on Saturday has risen to at least 30. The dump collapsed after heavy rain. An international study in Britain shows that the 6-ton altar stone in the ancient monument of Stonehenge travelled much further than previously thought. Analysis indicates that the rock could have only come from Scotland, about 700 kilometres away. It was originally thought to have been dragged from Wales. BBC News.
Hello and welcome to Health Check from the BBC. I'm Claudia Hammond here with your weekly dose of health news. Now, if you had colleagues or friends off work with COVID-19, as rates rise in at least 84 countries, we'll be asking what's going on now with COVID. And it's a topic which will be very familiar, I'm thinking, to my guest today, global health journalist Andrew Green. Welcome back. Now, I'm guessing, like me, you covered the pandemic. Does it kind of take you back to be hearing more about it again?
Yes, it's like flashbacks to 2 or 3 years ago all over again.
Yeah, and what else do you have for us today?
So I was thinking to take people inside their microwaves and kind of figure out what's living there. Spoiler, it's bacteria.
Yeah, and a lot of bacteria as well, it turns out. And we'll also be asking why the tobacco product snus seems to be popular among footballers. Is it giving them some kind of advantage or not? Now, before all that, even since last week's Health Check, there is already news on 2 viruses which we've been following. Now, the first is called Mpox, and the outbreak of a new kind in parts of Africa has been worrying people. Now, Andrew, this is different from the milder kind of Mpox, isn't it, that affected parts of Europe and the US beginning in 2022?
Yes, this is a more virulent strain that's centered in Central Africa and has reportedly killed more than 500 people so far this year alone.
And what has happened this week?
So we saw the Africa Centers for Disease Control, for the first time in its history, declare a public health emergency of continental security this week, which should hopefully bring in additional funds and additional attention to the spread of this virus.
Yeah, what will that mean in practice? Does something automatically have to happen, or will it mean the rest of the world takes some more notice?
I think the immediate result is that the rest of the world does take immediate notice. You're seeing a lot more attention paid to the outbreak that's been going on for a number of months now. But at the same time, it doesn't trigger any additional funding. The Africa CDC has said that they need billions of dollars to respond to this virus, but so far they've only gotten a few million. And so I think that there's some hope that the announcement will trigger additional funding from global donors.
And what needs to be done with that funding in particular to try to deal with this newer variant that seems to be causing concern?
So the first step is to get more vaccines into the countries that are seeing these huge outbreaks, specifically the the Democratic Republic of Congo and Central Africa. At the moment, Africa CDC says they only have access to about 200,000 vaccines, and they need somewhere around 10 million to meet the current need. And as the virus continues to spread, of course, that need's only going to get greater.
And we've been following another virus as well, which is called Oropouche, which is spread by mosquitoes and midges. Now, since January, there have been over 8,000 cases reported in countries including Brazil, Bolivia, Colombia, Peru, and Cuba. And then this week, it's been confirmed that cases have been found in Europe for the first time. So how many cases have been reported in Europe?
So far, there have been 19 reported cases in Europe, in Spain, Italy, and Germany so far.
And how would people have caught it?
So all of these cases have been linked to travel, either to travel to Cuba or to Brazil, where the disease is spreading at the moment.
And it's often, of course, when viruses reach the West that the world starts to take notice. Is it worrying that it's now being found in other countries on another continent too? Or is it inevitable that with travel cases will be found elsewhere, but that doesn't mean it spreads elsewhere?
I think it's inevitable that it's going to spread, especially with the amount of travel that takes place in the world. I think the risk of transmission within Europe is pretty low. They don't have the midges and mosquitoes that are responsible for transmitting the virus in Central and South America. But at the same time, this does raise concern about just the severity of the spread in Central and South America, that it's, infecting people who are there for a short period of time.
And what needs to be done in the case of this one in order to stop the spread in Central and South America?
So this one's even trickier because there's no real treatment or vaccine for Oropouche. So what needs to happen is control of the midges and mosquito vectors that are transmitting the virus. And that, requires a huge outpouring of resources in terms of insecticides and other kind of prevention methods to stop people from getting bitten and interrupt the chain of transmission.
And how serious is this one if people catch it?
So it's apparently quite painful and can knock you down for several days, if not weeks. It's not nearly as deadly as the Mpox. Problems for the baby once it's born, or fetal deformities. And there have been a couple reported cases of microcephaly where babies were born with smaller than expected heads after the mother had acquired Oropouche.
Well, thanks for that. Now, the reason, of course, that people take more notice of viruses spreading these days is that none of us can forget COVID-19, but it has not gone away. And depending on where you live in the world, you might well have had friends and colleagues finding they have COVID in the past few weeks or so. The World Health Organization has warned that there are new waves of infection at the moment in the Americas, Europe, and the Western Pacific. 84 countries are reporting an increase in positive test rates. And there's talk of variants you might have heard about with intriguing names like Flirt and Fluke that seem to be making a difference to it. So I thought it was time to find out what is going on with COVID these days from Professor Danny Altman, who's an immunologist at Imperial College London. I asked him what rates are like now around the world.
It's slightly harder to know than perhaps it was once upon a time, but obviously many countries are still following things like hospital admissions and deaths that mention COVID, and importantly in many countries PCR'd COVID in wastewater, poo water in sewage plants and things. And if you were looking at that, you'd have a fairly consistent picture across many countries where we're definitely in a bit of a peak. So to put that in context, nearly as bad as the last bad period we were in last Christmas.
So what's driving this rise in cases?
Well, I think the first thing you can say is it's reminding us that it's not yet seasonal and nothing like a seasonal common cold. And it's very hard to say. You could pluck answers, couldn't you? Behavioural changes or holiday travel or sports events or something, but I think it's more than that. I think it's just a kind of ongoing thing that hasn't settled down yet. Some of the numbers are very high. We all know people, don't we, all around us, who are off work yet again with their 5th or 6th or 7th or 8th infection, often 3 or 4 in a year.
And a lot of people will have heard of Omicron, the most recent variant to get a lot of publicity, if you like, but there are also these types called Flirt and Fluke. Can you explain what they are? Are they kind of almost spin-offs from Omicron?
Yeah, so the story so far is that, just when we thought we were coming out of the really bad period, we went into the Omicron period, and the Omicron period has been with us since 2022,
And then we already knew that it was such a distant relative of the virus we started with that, you know, our vaccine coverage was coping with it very poorly. And now that we're more than 2 years into the descendants of that Omicron and the mutations arising from that, we're far away even from the kind of Omicron variants that would have been seen in the last boosters. So when we talk about the new variants, fluke and flirt, those are silly names that just describe some of the amino acid mutations that make them different. And when I say make them different, obviously the difference is that they're really, really good at evading our vaccine and immune memory immunity and coming back for breakthrough infections again and again.
And so flirt variants have been blamed for some current travel warnings that there are in Greece. Is the situation there really that different to the rest of the world? I know they've even brought back some of the measures in hospital to try to prevent spread.
Yeah, I mean, you know, I looked at the data from Greece, and I can see how if I was going there on my holidays now, I'd take it a little bit seriously. Maybe I'd even wear a mask on the aeroplane or on the coaches or things. But in a way, a sensible person might do that anyway. So I can see that levels are quite high there, and hospital admissions are quite high there, and wastewater monitoring, which they do there, is quite high. But if you can hear kind of hesitation in my voice, it's also that I can understand why the tourist authorities there feel a little bit peeved, because if you look at what's going on there, it's not so very different to what's going on in England or the USA, for example. So, you know, I think we might be perceiving it as being bad because it feels very focused in, you know, crowded areas and centres of tourism. But I think it's not unique or special.
And there was a recent study coming out of the US suggesting that if you get reinfected with COVID, you might get the same severity of symptoms as you did perhaps the first time you got it, which seems surprising in a way if you've had it several times and had several vaccines and boosters. Is that because it keeps changing? Can we expect it to carry on being as severe?
Even for me, as a professor of immunology and a human immunologist, COVID keeps on throwing up, you know, new lessons and, yeah, eye-openers that teach us new stuff. So, you know, if you think way back to 2020, 2021, we were all peddling the possibility of herd immunity and that we'd be immune, or maybe we'd be vaccinated and infected and have hybrid immunity and we'd all be okay. And we're so far from okay, aren't we? You know, so many people we know are getting reinfected again and again. And even if you imagine that maybe in a vaccinated population, in a time of so-called mild Omicron variants, we'd all be getting mild infections and wouldn't really care. But, you know, I don't know about you, but a lot of people I know are really quite flawed by this still, quite symptomatic, having to take, you know, 5 to 10 days off work. So, to me, it's still a big deal. And I guess that the way that we cope when we meet the virus is kind of a complex interplay between the virus and our immune system. And I think some of us are just born with immune systems where it's going to floor us again and again and again. And that's our kind of programmatic set point.
But I guess it's still not as bad as the time when we saw a lot of people dying in hospital.
Yeah, no, I'm certainly not maximising or catastrophizing. We'll never forget the way that life looked and how terrifying it looked when we saw what was unwinding before us in early 2020, and terrified every time we saw an ambulance passing and, you know, ITU units not coping. Hopefully we'll never go back to those days. No, of course not.
And I know you've got a particular interest in long COVID. Are we still just as vulnerable to developing long COVID if we become infected, even if you've been infected before? Or is it if you didn't get long COVID the first time, then you're not as likely to get it again afterwards?
Yeah, no, it's a really important question that I think about a lot. It's like this: if you go back to those early days, the pre-vaccine days, and you got COVID, by now we all agree that all of those kind of first and second waivers from, if you like, 2020, 2021, their overall risk globally of getting long COVID was about 10%, which accounts for an awful lot of people in the world. And then you fast forward to today, when in most countries we have vaccinated populations and people who've met COVID, and weirdly today your risk of getting long COVID from the infection you've got at the moment is still about 2.5%. Yeah, so it's dropped maybe fourfold, but we've got an awful lot of cases, and 2.5% of those is a lot of long COVID.
So what do we need next from vaccines? Many of us will have only had the vaccines aimed at the very early variants, so do those need to change? There have been some different ones, haven't there, since?
I think we're in a phase of really awfully difficult discussions and decisions, because if I look at it as a hard-nosed immunologist and vaccinologist, I say, well, sure, the vaccines mean that we're kind of safe and we don't have that enormous case fatality rate. On the other hand, we're not doing that well. And if you look at the kind of vaccine efficacy of our old immunity, keeping us safe from the current variants, their efficacy is about 25% or so, just from any infection, yeah? It's certainly better than that against hospitalization or death. So vaccine immunity isn't serving us that well anymore, and there are lots of vaccine producers out there begging to be allowed to produce and sell to governments their next generation vaccines to keep us safe against the current variants, which they would do. And yet that's not happening, and it's not happening at pace. And that's not because of immunology, it's because of politics and behavioral science. If they roll out all of those vaccines, will there be departments of health all over the world prepared to take them? If departments of health buy them, will there be people queuing up in the vaccine clinics to take them? And the evidence suggests it might be a bit of a damp squib. If you look in the UK at the last spring booster program, the overall uptake of all those offered was something like 60-65%, but that was mainly skewed to kind of captive audience of the very elderly and those in care homes. The people who had a choice to go to the vaccine centre or not, very few of them went.
Yeah, it's interesting, isn't it? I guess if people don't perceive it to be that much of a problem anymore, and I guess if governments aren't seeing lots of people hospitalised, then they might decide it's not worth it to stop people having a week of illness, say.
It's hard. It's so hard. We really angst over this, about how to get this across the line and how to persuade policymakers about it. But it's a hard one to pull off, because I'm not an economist, but I'd imagine that if there were countries all over the world with lots and lots of people with a new recurrent infectious disease, where they're taking off a week here and a week there, perhaps 3 or 4 times a year, and then the risk of long COVID, that might be worth mitigating. But my sense is that it's hard to win that argument.
And what about the recent early stage clinical trials in nasal vaccines instead? Is something like that maybe going to be the future?
I'd love to imagine that that would be a game changer, because if you think back again to our excitement about the early trials with all of those first generation of vaccines that came along to save us, certainly I was pretty thrilled. I think we were all quite thrilled and excited. And yet then we got a bit perfectionist about it, didn't we? And say, but they're not completely blocking transmission.
Yeah.
And the reason they're not completely blocking transmission is that they need to be really kind of speedy to get that initial protection at the site of entry up your nose to stop it really taking hold. And no conventional vaccine in your arm is really good enough to do that. You need to stimulate the local immunity in your nasopharyngeal passage at the mucosal surfaces. And there have been so many contenders now that have come along that we think can really do that quite effectively. So I really hope that people out there will have the vision to embrace this as a really big solution to our woes.
Professor Danny Altman, you're listening to Health Check from the BBC. I'm Claudia Hammond, and global health journalist Andrew Green is still with me. I thought it was really interesting to hear there that fewer people are choosing to get vaccinated, even when they're being offered COVID vaccines for nothing.
Yeah, I mean, that raises concerns that were really high during the height of the outbreak about COVID vaccine skepticism. And it seems like that's sustained itself even in the years since.
And I wonder what's caught your eye recently when it comes to COVID.
Yes, on that note, I was reading a really alarming story that was published by MIT Technology Review recently about how COVID vaccine skepticism has been linked to false claims about HIV. And these are claims that are decades old, including lies that the virus doesn't exist or that HIV doesn't cause AIDS, or, echoing the kind of COVID vaccine skepticism, misinformation about the effectiveness of HIV treatment, which, at this point in time is responsible for saving millions of people's lives.
I think it's really interesting because as you say, there is so much evidence that HIV does cause AIDS, and there's so much evidence that the drugs, the antiretroviral drugs, can be really, really effective in saving, have saved millions and millions of lives. And you think that would be so clear now, but it's interesting that people are saying these things. How are these things getting traction? How are they being spread?
So there are a couple of methods, it seems. You see several HIV skeptics, HIV denialists who have megaphones or whose message is amplified through social media and podcasts, but it seems like Robert F. Kennedy Jr., who is running as a third-party candidate for U.S. president right now, has really become like the locus of all this misinformation. He's been spreading a lot of false claims about vaccines for years, and he's kind of always had Anthony Fauci as a boogeyman. Fauci, of course, was the COVID czar in the United States, but he also played a critical role in the global HIV response. And so he's kind of connecting these two things. He's saying, you know, Fauci lied about COVID and has also lied about HIV. Of course, this is all misinformation. I just want to be clear about that. There's absolutely no evidence that Fauci's lied about any of these things. But all of this has kind of been circulating and has gotten fed into this ecosystem of podcasts and social media, and it seems to be getting picked up and repeated, which can be, you know, quite dangerous.
What are the consequences of this kind of misinformation?
So I think the biggest concern is not that tens of thousands of people are going to stop their HIV treatment or that people aren't going to seek out health services. But I think the biggest concern is that if you get someone put in a position of power who's kind of taken up these conspiracies or who believes them in some way, that it might lead to cuts in funding, to international health programs or domestic health programs that could lead to people losing access to these life-saving services.
And are you surprised that the pandemic has made some people kind of less trusting of the science rather than more so? I completely wrongly predicted at the time. I thought, well, you know, people are going to see, well, you know, what can happen with viruses and you know, why medical science is so important and can save us from these things. But no.
Yes, yeah, I feel completely the same way as you, and I'm particularly surprised that this is catching on again with these false claims about HIV. Again, as you said, you know, we've seen the success of antiretroviral medicine. We've seen millions of people's lives saved, and so it's like, where are people getting a foothold to make these claims that this, either this virus doesn't exist or that the treatment for it doesn't work?
Yeah, well, thank you for that, and I think we will leave viruses for the moment. But football fans around the world will be looking forward to many of the major European leagues getting underway this week and next. And some footballers will be indulging in a little snus, which is a tobacco product. A study from Loughborough University, conducted earlier this year, found that 1 in 5 men playing professional football in the UK uses snus. Now, it's perfectly legal, but some of them believe it enhances their performance. So to find out more, the BBC's health and science correspondent, James Gallagher, has been talking to Professor Toby Mundell from Brock University in Canada, and he started by explaining what snus is.
Snus is a kind of smokeless tobacco which is different from the dried tobacco you might get in cigarettes and cigars. Snus is usually chopped up much finer and it's kept quite moist, and it allows it to be put into little sachets which you then place in your mouth. You suck it or even just put it against your cheek and it gets absorbed across the cheek, the blood vessels there, into the bloodstream.
And what does it feel like in the body when you take snus?
Well, when you take snus, just like other tobacco, you get an increase in heart rate, an increase in blood pressure, and like other stimulants, you probably feel quite aroused. So it's one of these things that probably helps all the different neurons in your brain connect quicker, and it's reinforcing.
And I was amazed when there were stories earlier this year about its use in sport, particularly in football in the UK.
Yeah, that's right. So snus use in the UK, I think, has been arrived since the Premier League started. Apparently, it was introduced by the Scandinavian players. So that would make it sort of a good 30, 40 years old in the UK, but it's only relatively recently that we've seen this coming to light in the media.
Why are athletes using it? What's the advantage?
I mean, snus, tobacco, nicotine, if we're getting nitty and gritty, there are some very obvious things. It's a stimulant, so much like caffeine, it's something that helps you in terms of your psychological, your cognitive abilities. It's addictive, and there's the potential for it to be performance enhancing. But despite all that, psychologically, we know that a lot of people like having a cigarette and coffee, for example, but we know that physically, there doesn't seem to be much use of having nicotine.
Do we have a real grasp of how common it is? Because I can imagine, even when we get these anonymous surveys of English footballers, even then, people aren't going to be fully honest, are they?
You're right, which is a good reason why we have something called doping tests. So the interesting thing is that since about 2010, all WADA accredited labs test for nicotine, along with lots of other substances, in any samples, which are typically urine samples they get out of competition, in competition, drug testing. And so we actually have a pretty good idea, not of where it comes from. We can't say it came from snus, it came from smoking, it came from a patch. But we do know in terms of nicotine what the prevalence is. And it's actually very scary because we conducted the largest one, which was about 60,000 samples, ranging from sort of recreational athletes all the way to international world leading. And anywhere between 1 in 4 and 1 in 2 athletes has nicotine present in their system.
If there's a potential advantage then, Toby, why isn't snus use banned?
Now, its use doesn't determine whether or not it's banned. In order for it to be elevated onto the prohibited list, there's 3 things. The first is it has to be an unfair advantage. So the most obvious one is, yeah, if it means that someone taking nicotine or snus is going to perform better, that's the first flag. Now, the research that's been done doesn't support that. It shows that actually there's probably no benefit. The second is there has to be a clear health risk to the athlete. And again, that's where we know that there's health risks of smoking and general tobacco use, but there's a whole range of different ways in which we can take nicotine. And I don't think there's the research out there to support absolute health risk of nicotine on its own. And then the final thing is that it needs to go against the spirit of sport, which is probably determined by the first 2. And so what we have is we don't have enough evidence to basically bump nicotine up to that banned list because, first and foremost, the research that's out there doesn't show that it's performance enhancing.
Toby, thank you so much for chatting.
My pleasure.
And I hope you're not going to have a post-interview snooze.
No, I won't be, I promise.
Maybe a snooze.
Yeah, maybe a snooze.
Dear, oh dear, James, that is a very bad joke. Professor Toby Mundell there talking to James Gallagher. Now, before we go, Andrew, there's just time to talk about a new study on microwaves having their own microbiome, so their own combination of bacteria and other microbes. That doesn't sound very nice. This is from a team in Valencia in Spain. What did they do?
So they decided that they were going to test to see if bacteria can survive in microwaves. So they went and swabbed 30 different microwave ovens, some in households, some in offices, and some in laboratories.
And what did they find?
So they were able to grow a total of 101 different bacterial strains from the swabs, which is,
101? That's quite a lot, isn't it?
Yeah, it's quite a large number considering that I think, like me, most people thought that a microwave would kill all bacteria.
Yeah, because it's getting everything in there really hot, isn't it? Well, it's getting your food really hot, so you're assuming that it's also doing that with bacteria. Is that surprising then, scientifically, that it doesn't?
Well, so I think that they were not surprised to find a few strains of what are called extremophiles. These are these bacterial strains that have been known to survive in really harsh conditions. So we're talking about like sub-zero temperatures or extreme heat, and so it's no surprise that they're then capable of surviving in a microwave as well.
And what are these bacteria? Are they bad for our health? Does it matter that they're in our microwaves?
So it does to some extent. I mean, some were just human skin bacteria, so not really alarming in any way. But there were a few that were associated with foodborne illnesses, which of course is not something that you want to find in your microwave.
Yeah, so what should people do? Does this mean we need to scrub out the microwave like you might scrub an oven?
Exactly. I think that's the solution. Maybe use the normal products you would clean your kitchen, and make sure you also clean the inside of your microwave while you're at it.
Well, you can find that in the journal Frontiers in Microbiology if you'd like to know more. Well, thank you very much, Andrew Green, for joining us from Berlin today. The producer was Dan Welsh, and our studio engineers were Emily Preston and Sue Mayo. I'm Claudia Hammond. Do join me next week for another episode of Health Check from the BBC. Bye for now.
This is the BBC World Service, and on this week's assignment...
I'm Alex Last, and I'm in Arizona, where a kind of school revolution is underway. Here, parents who don't want their kids in public schools can get state funds to go private. So is this the future of education in America?
Assignment at bbcworldservice.com/assignment. In an hour, the guest on Hard Talk is...
Pavel Latrushka, a key figure in the opposition movement struggling for regime change in Belarus. Belarus's authoritarian ruler, Alexander Lukashenko, is a staunch ally of Vladimir Putin. Does that mean change in Minsk can only come with change in Moscow.
This is the BBC World Service, the world's radio station.
Welcome to NewsHour from the BBC World Service. I'm Rebecca Kesby. Today, as Ukrainian forces continue their advance inside the Russian territory of Kursk, we hear from the Russian side and how civilians are trying to evacuate.
Although the conflict has been actively going on for now 2.5 years, I don't think that anyone expected something like this on this kind of scale to happen.
We have a special report from Afghanistan where hundreds of thousands of refugees have been forced to return after being expelled by Pakistan, in this case of this man after 46 years.
I swear it hurts. It is really painful. Now I'll have to start a new life because I lost my home.
Plus, playing teenage characters on stage when you're 80, and Stonehenge's Scottish Stone. It's all coming up after the news. Hello, I'm Govinda Gill with the BBC News. The World Health Organization has declared the Mpox outbreak in parts of Africa a public health emergency of international concern. The disease, formerly known as monkeypox, has killed more than 450 people in the Democratic Republic of Congo. It has also been detected in Burundi, the Central African Republic, Kenya, Uganda and Rwanda. Dorcas Wangera